Thank you, everybody. We'll get started. I know there's a few other people on the way, but we are here for the 6th session of our startup and residence training for startups. We had a Skillshare with the Department of Technology about agile software development earlier in the day. A lot of these folks were there. It was a great start to the STIR activities. And today's session is something that I think a lot of folks have been eagerly awaiting and talking about since the very beginning, which is how do I acquire government clients for the products I'm developing? So we have 2 sections of this training. We've got a panel with these fine folks that I'll introduce in a minute. And then we have a session with the folks from CityMart to talk about a bit more about RFPs, but we have the opportunity to learn from other successful government technology entrepreneurs about what it was like for them to get their first couple clients and scale up. We'll have plenty of time for questions, and this should be pretty informal. So as we go through this dialogue and this conversation, please just chime in. Let's see. Yep, that is our agenda. And I am Lawrence Grodeska. Many of you know me. Most of you know me already. I will be your friendly moderator. And I'm going to sit down, because there's no need to stand up so awkwardly. So with us today, we have Tiffany Chu, co-founder and CEO, or?
Well, that's actually a point of discussion. I'm actually like the Chief Design Officer.
Chief Design Officer, okay.
Yeah.
Of Remix.
Of Remix.
Yeah, and would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into government technology and what Remix does.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a designer. I studied architecture and urban planning in school. I got into civic tech when actually through planning. I've always been really interested in working with cities. I worked in New Orleans as my first internship ever, right after Katrina hit, and that kind of gave me my first taste of city government, which is pretty crazy. And then I went on to do a couple different things in the realm of design. Worked at a design consultancy called Continuum up in Boston, and then worked at Zipcar as their first UX researcher / designer. Came into contact with a number of cities through just working at Zipcar, because Zipcar needed to really forge partnerships in order to be successful. And then wanted to make the move out west, so applied to Code for America, was a fellow in 2014, and Remix came out of a side project during that time.
Great. Thank you for being here. If you could pass the microphone. FYI, this microphone is for the live stream. You can't hear it in the room, but the folks online need you to have that in front of your mouth if you're going to talk.
And how many people are online?
I am checking in there right now, but we've got at least 3. There may be a few more in the next few minutes. So our next presenter is Tamara Manick-Perlman. Is that close?
Close, yeah.
Co-founder and CEO of Next Request. So why don't you tell us how to pronounce your name properly and a little bit about yourself?
Sure, it's
and your company.
Manick-Perlman, yeah.
Okay, Manick.
But yeah, it's fine. I was also actually a fellow at Code for America a year earlier in 2013. My path to civic technology was slightly different. My background is in data science and spatial data analysis. So I was a geographer and built web mapping and analysis applications for sort of a boutique software company that did a lot of consulting with governments from the local level to the federal level. So built applications for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, doing water resource planning, Veterans Affairs, but also did a lot of work with the city of Philadelphia. So I really got to understand the problems that governments face, and really liked what I did and really admired the people that we worked with, but a lot of the work we did was really one-off. It wasn't super replicable, and so I was really interested in moving more into product, and rather than sort of building a project, handing it off when it isn't a reasonable state, but not something that you're 100% happy with, when you think, oh, I'd love to continue tweaking this. Well, that's what you get to do with product. You get to continually refine your vision. So that's what took me to Code for America, and we built a public records processing platform that was inspired by a project during that 2013 fellowship, and have continued to build that out and get new government customers.
Including some recent funding.
Yes, yeah, we actually just raised some money to continue building the company even more. So it's exciting. Thanks.
That's good. We need a healthy ecosystem.
And last but not least, Dan Parham, CEO and head of product, co-founder at Neighborland.
I like to call myself the janitor. I sweep the floors and keep the lights on. Another way of saying it is I'm the fool who signs the front of the check. My path to Civic Tech really comes through product design. So I started off as a product designer way back when, 1998, working for a little company called Roadrunner, which is a high-speed network on the East Coast of the U.S. So watched that product take off, and it was a great experience early in my career, and ended up at Time Warner. I was there for several years and ended up being the head of platform as the product and designer. So we didn't have product managers at that time. It was a New York-based company, and if your title was creative director, that meant that you were product manager and designer. So I like that. I think that that's an ideal role for me. So with a very small team at a very large company, we actually built out the core platform. So the entire pattern library and code library for all of Time Warner's products, including a little company called America Online. So that was in 2005. Got poached by Yahoo, came out here in 2006, worked on 3 teams for them in the marketplace division. So I basically built 3 teams from scratch for Yahoo and ended up on ad platform. And that's when I realized that I didn't want to steal people's attention for money, which is what all of the companies that I had worked for up until that time were doing. They were stealers, not healers. And so I took a big step back. My wife sold a business. She's a successful entrepreneur, one for one. Traveled for a year and reconnected with a really inspiring urban planner named Candy Chang, and decided to start Neighborland. So I've been at it for about 5 years.
Great. So I would like to start the conversation off, so please, Tiffany, if you wouldn't mind. This is a little bit of a curveball with the questions you're presented, but I think you should have some good answers. Tell us about your sales failures and successes, maybe one of each or both, as a way just to kind of get us started talking about selling to government clients. What has been something that was just facepalm, sort of ugh moment, and what's one of your biggest successes that, and you don't have to, if someone else wants to start, feel free.
Such an intimate question.
I'll start with a big old failure. Speak it off, like open it up. So, I mean, really the big failure for us was Neighborland 1.0, right? The first version of Neighborland was pretty simple. We went out and asked residents in New Orleans, what did you want to see in your community? And so we were faced with a really challenging distribution problem. And I'll never forget the first headline in a newspaper about our product. It was in the Times-Picayune, and it was Neighborland of Pipe Dreams. And the idea was, we were just collecting ideas. There was actually a spoof comedy show that came out of New Orleans that like spoofed us a couple years later. Just about like how ridiculous it was to ask people for their ideas when clearly what we need to work on are social justice issues and poverty and all these things, right? Like the issues are obvious. Why are we asking people what the issues are? It was interesting, like the first idea that got any traction was around the streetcar, going from downtown out to 9th Ward. And that's what the pipe dreams comment was, because building a streetcar is actually a $100 million project. And we took a lot of heat from that, and we were dismissed for that in a lot of ways. And I went into, to your question, I went into City Hall and met with the council member whose district we were in, and she was like, what is this? Like, why? I don't need any more ideas. I already have like my top 3 priorities: murder, water management, blight. If your product doesn't solve one of those things, then I'm not interested in it. Thank you for coming by. It's interesting. 6 months later, we worked with Councilwoman Palmer. She came out to a Neighborland event after we had started a parade around people that really wanted to see this streetcar and didn't want to say no to this idea. And she came out and supported it. That's what politicians are really, elected officials are really good at, is getting at the front of the line of a parade. And so what was perceived as a selling failure right? Like, she didn't pay any money for it. She didn't even at first lend any social capital to us at all. No political capital, let alone social capital. But 6-7 months later, once she saw that we had actually helped thousands of residents connect around this issue and talk about things like, how do you apply for a Tiger grant as a community group versus a government? I didn't know you could do that either, right? But that was the whole process of realizing that people can do amazing things, and elected officials will, once they see a lot of momentum, they'll step up. So that was like a big learning experience about electeds and bureaucrats and what motivates them and what their incentives are. And there's a big difference between going in as you guys are and being embedded in city and asking them, like, what problem do you want me to solve, and being a company on the outside and saying, like, hey, you should really solve this problem. So I applaud you. You'll have a lot better sales traction by building relationships with people, solving the problems that they've been thinking about for years and years and years. But the next time you're in New Orleans and you want to take a streetcar from the French Quarter down to Bywater, hop on and ring the bell and think about this story.
Oh, man. There's so many failures. How do you pick from them? I guess I'll start with a success, just because I think success is often sweeter when it comes after some adversity. And so I think this kind of illustrates a lot of the challenges you might face as you're working with governments. So one of our early clients, though not our first client, was the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so, we'd reached out to them through connections that we had through Code for America. They'd been a Code for America city. Part of what we had to do was kind of figure out, like, who were the sort of the leaders in this space, who's likely to be open to innovation and trying new things. And so for us, it was like, okay, the cities that are involved in Code for America, that there are lots of other ways to find proxies for that in whatever, your domain is. So we reached out to them, talked to them about our product. They were really interested. I think, we talked to some people in the city who I would consider a champion, which is something that you really want when you're working with an agency, because if there's no one willing to take that time and go to the mat for you, it's really easy to get lost in the process. And so I think they were really interested, but the procurement rules in that city, as in many other cities, were that they had to send this out to RFP if it was above a certain amount. And so, I think that we thought that we were like close to closing a contract and sort of tasting that success, and then it fell off very quickly. I mean, I think that if you don't take that time to sort of figure out who are all the players, who are the people that need to be in the room, take the time to understand, what is the process in this agency, you can think that you're close to the finish line and then find that actually, that gets snatched away from you. So ultimately, they had to go through their standard process. It went out to RFP. We submitted a bid. We went through the whole process. And thankfully, the contract was awarded to us, and we had the opportunity to work with the same great people that we'd been in contact with earlier. But I think the lesson that we really learned there is, even if you do have a champion, it's really up to you to figure out who are all the stakeholders, who are the people that could say no or that could delay your project, and make sure that you know that information as early as possible so that you can begin addressing any of those barriers efficiently, rather than having them kind of jump out at you as a surprise later on. Yeah.
Great point. I learned to write this sentence in emails. Who needs to sign off on this?
Okay, I'll talk about a failure. So super early on in our company's long, storied year and a half history, so we had just gone through YC in winter of 2015, and kind of during that time, we were trying to sign just as many contracts as we could. We just wanted to prove that someone would pay something for what we had built. It was like super stressful, literally begging for people to sign something and pay us something. And so Remix, just in a nutshell, we are a mapping platform that helps cities and transit agencies plan better public transit. And we had gotten like an inkling of interest from Vancouver. We were like, oh my God, Vancouver, such a cool city. Let's fly up there and do a demo, blah, blah, blah.
Two guys at the end of the table.
Oh, okay. So you guys are grinning. So we were like, okay, we'll like pull out all the stops. You know, it's Vancouver. We'll fly up there and meet them in person. Did that, and then did a great demo. Everyone was really well dressed, like the best dressed trans agency I've ever met is TransLink. And at the end of the meeting, we were talking to our team. We were like, okay, you know, we really want to work with you guys. Let's sign a deal. And we signed like a really small contract, like piddly. Like they were going to pay us something, but it was like peanuts. And we're like, okay, yes, sign it. So they signed it, and then I went back to my product team. So I was like acting as, you know, the founder who was most focused on revenue at this point. And the product team was like, oh, well, you know, Vancouver's like international, like they have a different census data set than the US, and it's going to be a whole like nightmare of product requirements that they're going to need that we don't have yet because we've only been building for the US. And I was like, oh my God, like, why didn't I think this through? Like, I was just like, and what ultimately turned out, and this is a story of failure, by the way. We were too early in our product development life cycle to sign on such a huge, demanding, sophisticated customer. You know, Vancouver's huge. They have a whole team of planners. They have a whole team of technologists. And we were just too early on to serve them well and serve their pain points in a way that was of value to them. So long story short, the contract, it was like a pilot, and it came up for renewal at the end of last year. And because it took so long for our product development team to really properly address all of the really technical questions that they had, they ended up not renewing. And this is like my biggest failure so far, and I like couldn't even remember it when he asked about failures because I had blocked it out of my memory. I will say we're still on like, you know, good terms with the planners, and I think they'll reconsider. I mean, I think we're at a really good point now. We could really help them, but I think the pilot did not go as smoothly as we had thought it would be, and I wish we engaged them at a point when we were just more prepared for them.
Well, thank you for your honesty and
for everyone to learn about.
So to follow up on that, you've all had many successes since these failures. So what are some of the things that you did after your first couple clients to expand on that success and keep growing? You know, what are some of the things that worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tiffany's anecdote is pretty instructive in terms of I think the hardest lesson as an entrepreneur, and the hardest lesson of product in particular, is saying no, and even saying no and sort of turning down or deferring an opportunity when it seems really promising, but when, you know, the amount of work that you're going to need to do to serve that client isn't going to pay off. So, you know, I don't know the kind of specifics of the products and projects you're working on, but, you know, Next Request Late deals with the public records process, and so there's a federal FOIA law, but there are this is sort of actually maybe a sales failure lesson. You know, there are different laws in each state of the country, and so it's really easy to say, hey, you know, we want to be a national company, we want to touch as many cities as possible, you know, we want to have a really ambitious vision and be in all 50 states. But if you think about the implications of that, you know, it's similar to what Tiffany was saying around like the data that your clients are working with. You know, that means that rather than becoming an expert on public records laws in California and saying like, okay, I can serve every agency in California because they're all dealing with the same laws, every time, you know, I do a pitch, if we're trying to pitch to agencies in 50 states, I have to be an expert on the public records laws of 50 states. And so, you know, if someone asks about something in Arizona, I have to be ready to give them a good answer. And I also have to be able to show them, yes, you know, our product has been built to serve the needs of Arizona, not just California, even though, you know, that was sort of the initial inspiration. So I think that, you know, being really deliberate about your sales and expansion and product strategy is really key. Sort of understand, you know, with a basic, MVP or the product that you've built so far, what is the most efficient use of your resources and time, and how do the strategies that your sales team is using impact all of your other teams? What are the implications for your product team? What are the implications for your customer support team? If you're trying to do too many things at once. And I think the second lesson, just pile all the lessons on, is I think balancing the needs of the needs and the accountability that different teams face is hard, because the sales team wants to close deals, and so it can be really tempting to tell a client, oh, we don't have that yet, but we'll totally build that for you. But if the thing that they want, maybe it's a bigger contract, or maybe it's something that seems promising, but if the thing that you're promising that you're going to build is actually going to divert your company away from the core product strategy and the thing that's going to help you succeed long term, that might be a relationship that you just have to kind of defer or work on in a different way, rather than sort of trying to serve the needs of lots of different places at once, because that can be really be a distraction, and it can also mean that from a product perspective, you're not being deliberate about how you build your product out, that you're just sort of bolting things on in a way that can potentially lead you to something that's difficult for the development team to maintain, and more taxing for the support team to support. So a friend of mine talked about it in terms of like surface area. Every time you develop a new feature, you're increasing the surface area of your product, and that's more work for everyone in the company. So make sure that you really want to do that if you're adding something new.
Have you ever gotten a situation where they're like, a client's been like, I really want this feature, and that gives you an entree to say, okay, well, if you'll, pay more for this feature, or you'll put some money up front for this, we'll deploy those resources in that way. Has that ever been something else? And if it has been, how do you tee up that conversation with them?
Yeah.
To make that, or how do you make that push into, I know this is kind of getting away from the civic space, perhaps, but.
And to repeat the question, has I've got a mic. Has a client request for a new feature ever been an open door to a conversation about additional contract or additional revenue from them?
Yes. And I think that the answers for those are, the wisdom of pursuing that conversation is just going to vary a lot based on sort of, is that on your product roadmap? Where on your product roadmap is it? And is that feature of value just to that client? Or, if it's on your roadmap, presumably it's of value to a lot of other clients. We have done that on a couple occasions. I think time will tell. I would say at this point, it was a mistake both times.
This concept of paying to prioritize your roadmap, right? This is a good one. Product management's a little bit like making love. Everybody thinks they're good at it. Okay? It's difficult. I've actually I've worked on communications platforms for 20 years. Some of the products I've worked on have had over 200 million users. And people look at Neighborland often and say you don't know what you're doing, right? So hey, we want to do business with you, but we want to do this configuration to Neighborland to make it work. And oftentimes one of the biggest costs is explaining to a potential client all the work that we've done to measure where we are. What you see today is actually the product of thousands of iterations of the UX. So even having that conversation with someone to explain to them why their idea is a bad idea is costly. So the short answer is just triple the cost. Hey, do you want us to build that? How much do you really care about that feature? Great, we'll charge you $500 an hour for it. And this feature over here, no, we'll actually just build that as part of the deal. Right, so you do have that leverage, right? You have all this insight about what works in the space. You can present data in a short-winded way, but you can also use money as a way to determine how much people really want to see something, right? We've had people that have asked us to do hosted Neighborland. Great, absolutely, it's $500,000 a year. Wait, but regular Neighborland's $12,000 a year. Yep, because now you're asking us to like have another engineer to maintain this instance and yada yada. Or, hey, we want to host this on something other than AWS. Great, it's $500,000 a year. We can totally do it. We have computer scientists that work at Neighborland. They are not hackers. They are super, super good, right? And they will do it. If you'd like to pay their salaries, step right up. So that's a little bit of like how we deal with that. In fact, our entire business came from a total like, oh snap moment where we needed money. So we basically were running out of money, and we needed to go raise more money, and we didn't have enough traction. If anybody's watching Silicon Valley and they've seen the DAU episode, that's basically exactly where we were about 3 years ago. We were just like, wow, we've got a ton of people who signed up, and our DAU is terrible. So this idea that we're going to be a consumer platform, much like Nextdoor has become, like that was off the table. And so we had to rapidly pivot. And the way that we rapidly pivoted was the Knight Foundation and Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the Health Trust and a company called Google were looking to engage residents in Mountain View around the future development of the city. And they were going out and trying to raise money around building a platform. And fortunately, we were visible enough in the space that people kept saying, well, why don't you just use Neighborland? That's what Neighborland does. But we actually didn't have those tools built. None of those administrative tools were built. So they came in and we had a conversation and we said, great, we can build that out for not $500,000, for like a very reasonable amount of money, because we really didn't have another choice. We had to take a bet on, hey, we're gonna build out collaborative publishing, right? We're basically gonna do what Medium does with the 4 of us in like 5 weeks. Awesome. Let's go try to do that. And it was bumpy for sure, but we shipped it. We got it out there. We learned a ton from the process. What an incredible experience to work with Jacqueline Fuller at Google and Greenbelt Alliance, who was the client on that project, and Carol Coletta at the Knight Foundation. Like, what does happen with a lot of these projects where people ask you to like build something special, they do have a lot of intelligence, and you should see it as a research opportunity, and you should charge money as if that's what it is, right? And then basically say, okay, and what actually happened from that project is we retained 80% of that, of what we built for them. We had to like iterate and redo it, but that's sort of how we got lucky on that, because that could have gone the other way. After that, what we learned from it was charge 5 times the amount of money, 10 times the amount of money, right? It's true. Like when the engineers first said that to me, I thought it was not considerate of how difficult the sales process is, right? But I think that there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing before that question. I would say that, yeah, 3 times the amount of money is probably still within the tolerances of your engineers misestimating how long it's going to take them to build it. So that's why I was saying, no, do like 5, do 10. But I think more than that, also, if someone, even if you're telling them, oh, this is a product feature and we need this to work for all of our clients, it still sets up sort of an emotional expectation on their part that you are building something for them and that you are building something to their spec, which means that it may not be built in the way that you would build it were you free of that constraint and were you saying, hey, what is the optimum way for this to work for all of our clients if you're optimizing for their particular use case. So I would, obviously there are times when you have no choice. There are certainly times, as Dan is saying, where, it's something you wanted to do anyway, so maybe you don't charge at all. You just say, hey, it's clear that there's a sort of weight of interest behind this and we should just do it. But I would approach that with, so much caution. You have a question, but I don't know if Tiffany wanted to
Tiffany
add.
Respond to that question about how you got your next couple clients. There's a couple, I want to get back to procurement, so if we could hold on questions for right now. So.
Okay. So the way that we got our first couple clients was we went to our users who were using our free prototype at the time, which had gotten a ton of interest just through word of mouth and online and Twitter. And it's funny because the people who saw our prototype of Remix, which was called Transit Mix back in 2014, they were like the young, hungry junior planners who actually read the internet and got really excited, would email us, and they're like, this is great, I want all these features, blah. But what happened was when we started talking to them and trying to understand their needs and their organizations and the purchasing process in the agencies in which they worked, they were almost never the buyer. They were like, a few years out of school, like super hungry, but just did not have the power of the purse. So what we had to do is we had to figure out an elegant way of looping in their manager or their manager's manager or their director into the next level of our conversation. So what we would do is we'd have just a discovery call, just a learning call with the planner. Hey, what are you working on? What's important to you? Why do you like Remix? Then what we would do is we would set up a second conversation with the decision maker. Usually we would find out, if you wanted to purchase something, who would need to sign off? Who would need to make that decision? And they'd be like, oh, this person, and then this person would probably have like some sort of weigh in, maybe like somebody in IT or like maybe somebody in procurement, maybe not yet. Then we would try to set up a larger meeting, like a demo of sorts, where we would walk through our product, but make sure that everyone who would have a say in the decision-making process was a part of that initial conversation, so that they felt like they were a part of the process, and B, we could unveil or kind of, I guess, really understand what all of their concerns were, if there were any. It wouldn't be through like a third party part of the conversation where it's like, oh, my boss said that their boss said that it's not going to work, so I'm sorry, I can't talk to you anymore. So that's the way that we got our next, 20 customers. And then we started kind of really honing our pricing structure and really blowing out our entire sales process. And now we're at 110 customers.
Excellent. So there's a couple different sales conversations happening here. There's direct sales, and also tomorrow you talked about responding. Direct sales opportunity that turned into an RFP process. So can you talk a little bit about procurement based sales versus more direct sales, and just your experience responding to RFPs generally as a sales opportunity?
Yeah, I don't know if this is too much straight talk, but our rule of thumb is don't do it. I would say that 80% of the time an RFP has been written because someone found something that they liked, they went to their managers, they were told that they had to go through the RFP process, and so if they're reaching out to you, it's because they need 3 quotes in order to check off the boxes to complete the RFP process.
Yeah, couple things. So one way to know that you're doing something right is when it's your product that an RFP is written about, right? And the way that you see that is when someone says, we're looking for more than a website. We're looking for a communications platform for urban planning, something like My Sidewalk or Neighborland. Like in parentheses, your name of your company, or like one thing that I really like with like a company like Street Plans that really is focused on tactical urbanism is that he wrote a book about tactical urbanism, and it doesn't have to be a book. You could write just like a really convincing post, but he put language into a business opportunity, and so you see in RFPs now tactical urbanism in the RFP. So what's interesting is if you use the tools that allow you to look at RFPs, which are not great tools, but if you have something as specific as tactical urbanism, you can go into some of those tools and actually find some of those. But really, a lot of times leaders of civic agencies will, if you go out and do the direct, it's not sale, it's actually business development. If you go out and you just have a conversation with the city about your tool and how it might help them. But that usually what that means is you will be top of mind for them when they craft an RFP. And when they craft the RFP, hopefully someone gives you a heads up. Or you have to have someone on your team that takes part of their time, or you have a head count that searches RFPs all day. And I don't know at what stage a company can afford to do that. I think it's when you have a sales team of 3 or 4 that you can actually afford business development and RFP searching and all that stuff. So we haven't gotten there yet. That our 200 customers have all been inbound. So there's been a little bit of like, I'm out there talking to a lot of people and I'm doing business development but that's overhead. I'm the only one that does that. So everything else has been, inbound inquiries like, hey, we're interested in a tool like this. Can you explain it a little bit more to us?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I'll add to that before handing this off to Tiffany is you want to avoid, the RFPs are generally written with something in mind, and maybe it is your product in mind, though you'll usually know if that's the case. I would also say that you want to avoid RFPs as much as possible. Now, it's going to depend a lot on your product and the pricing and the value proposition that you offer. So, in our case, I think that very early on, it was really critical for us to figure out a pricing model that enabled us to avoid going out to bid. So for many agencies, it was a question of doing research, maybe looking in the municipal code, maybe looking somewhere on the purchasing or the procurement website to understand what are the procurement limits for this city. And let's be sure that when we send them a proposal, that the amount that our proposal is for is below their procurement threshold. So if it's the amount, this is probably not the case for you guys, but if it's an amount that they can put on their credit card, that's, your goal, number one. But maybe it's an amount where, it's under, say, $10,000 or $25,000. And so you can give them a quote, and then they have to do an informal process where they just have to call people up and get 2 other quotes to compare you to, and then as long as they're happy with you, they can purchase your product. It's when you get into those higher thresholds, usually between say like $20,000 and $100,000, that they actually are, no matter how much of a champion they are for your product, and no matter how much you send them letters, which you should also prepare, which is a sole source justification, laying out what makes your product absolutely unique. I'd say only some of the time will this sole source justification enable you to skip that RFP process if the pricing on your product is, in that range above. It could be anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000, $30,000 in most cities.
Your thoughts on procurement versus more direct business development as a business strategy, sales strategy?
Oh, yeah. So definitely aligned with Tamara. We try not to do RFPs unless we're forced to. On the flip side, I think sometimes RFPs are really great because you know exactly what the government wants, and if you don't fit those bullet points, just don't respond to it. It's just really simple. I would say that for us, we have a fairly unique product. We are probably the only one out there. So oftentimes when people do write RFPs, it's pretty clear that they want us. So that's good. But generally, I would say if you can spend the time on like an RFP toolkit, that's like, okay, here are all the standard things that someone might ask for in an RFP, and so you can just like send it off in an hour versus poring over it for weeks, that would probably be your best bet.
Great. Question from Dan. And we'll open up to some questions after.
And that's that's sort of building on the idea of the sole source justification, right? Tiffany and I both work in the urban planning space, and there's a pretty standard format for like how the questions that you have to answer. And all the big firms, they have a team that actually prepares their RFP responses, but you can hack that process by just like figuring out what the 5 or 6 things are. If you do it in an intelligent way, you can create, for example, an extensible RFP response, right? We can do it. InDesign is a great tool for doing that kind of stuff, where you can just have the sections that you need and sort of, cut and paste and try to keep any of the custom writing that you're doing in terms of responding to specific bullet points, like on the first page, and that's it.
Great. So, Krista, did you have a question that's still kind of? Okay. Yeah, please.
Can you talk to me about how you handled the initial pricing discussions for your first several users? Because I'm having that right now, and I feel like I'm like dancing around like what I want to charge, but I want to make sure it's not too much, but I want to leave money on the table, and just like how you manage that.
Yeah.
So the question was, just to repeat it for the live stream, how you handled the initial conversation about pricing structure with your first couple clients.
Well, first of all, congratulations for getting to that point. I would say for the first few customers, you're going to leave money on the table. You're you're going to, and then you can try to make that up as you go along and get more customers. What we did was we would ask, hey, what is your personal spending threshold to the champion who feels most strongly about you, and just literally say, hey, this is what we would ideally charge, but because we want to just show our appreciation for you coming on board as an early customer, we're willing to do a 6-month pilot for you guys, 12-month pilot at this lower price point, and then once you guys are up and running and successful, then we can talk about year 2 or something like that. So just make it just as simple as you can for them, and then build up value throughout the course of that. But don't, and then we've done this in the past where we kind of did the lower pricing for quite some time, and we had to figure out how to essentially renegotiate everyone to be more at a similar level. And I would say that is a struggle you will have to go through if you do get to that point, and that's just kind of inevitable. It's like you just got to get your first couple customers. Yes.
So the follow-up question to what you just answered. So how difficult was, especially working with the government, right? So typically, how difficult it was to go back to the table and renegotiate after a year?
It depends how good of a job you did throughout that course of the year. Did you visit them on site? Did you come up with a customer success plan? Did you make sure that they were successful and measure the return on investment of your software compared to their existing methodology?
Did you see any kind of, like for an employee or for your champion to go back and renegotiate with the department or with their seniors or within their organization? Did you find any kind of was it a smooth process? Once you had reached out, was it a smooth process, or did you find within the government, because there are certain streamlined ways in which things are probably done, or that's the perception from one side?
Yeah.
Did you find is that a perception, or was there a reality when when people you were dealing with had to go back and renegotiate a different price year, 2 years down the line?
And just to repeat the question, we're talking about contract renegotiations with existing clients. How difficult was it, and were there streamlined processes that made it more challenging, or was it generally smooth with those strong champions?
Yeah, I think it's really how embedded your solution or software became throughout the course of your initial year 1. I would put a ton of investment just making sure that your early customers are really successful, kind of like at whatever cost, because if churn is the killer of all SaaS businesses. So what we would do for early customers, we would meet them in person, meet them at a conference, and sit down with them and be like, hey, at what point do you need to get to in order to renew? And then, by the way, we launched 40 new features in the last year. We are going to have a new pricing structure by the time renewal comes around. And hey, maybe you want to lock in that new pricing structure for 3 to 5 years, something like that. And then the bumpier the process was, it was usually based on how the level of seniority of the champion.
Yeah, I definitely co-sign everything Tiffany said. I think a couple of things that we learned early on were around pricing. There's there's the price that your champion needs, and then there's the price that you hope to get eventually. So I think for a couple early clients, we would sort of give them this lower price, and that would be the price on the proposal. And we're all for government transparency, but it means that if someone else ever requests that or looks at that, they'll see that price and they'll say, well, you gave it to this client for this much. So I think one thing that we did that was pretty key starting early on was give people the price that we thought they should be paying for our product in the future, and then give them a substantial discount in the first few years so that the amount they're actually paying you is comfortable for them. They feel like, they're taking a risk if you're a new company, so they feel safe about that. But when it comes time to come back to the table, you can point at that higher number and say, okay, well, this is the actual cost of the product. We gave you this discount. You can call it whatever you want, early adopter discount, regional leader discount, all kinds of things. But just, you're both testing this out, and it gives you the ability to come back and say, well, that low price you were paying was a highly discounted price. And as Tiffany said, if you're doing a good job with your product, you have a ton more features when you come back a year later, so it's easier to justify, the higher price that they should be paying. Yeah, that's the main thing.
So just to the original question around pricing, I think one of the things that was a big shock for me, and maybe you can correct me, but YC, Matter, our investors are True, Obvious, Lear, right? These are thousands of successful companies. Many of them are billion-dollar companies, and you ask the VCs, like, so how do we figure out pricing? And I didn't go to business school, so I always think that there's a book, an article, or something that will tell you, like, how to do pricing. And every one of these incredibly bright people just said, go figure it out. The wind is like, what's the market, right? Like, what is it? What's the value? So you really have to understand what is the value that you're providing. And there is some education that goes along with getting people to understand this idea of you're not having to maintain any software. You can cancel at any time. There's no staff that's going into this. You know, you can use this platform without hiring any staff. So there is some work that you have to do to really educate around, like, what is the value of SaaS? And like, this is a really important point. You know, we're one of the platform partners for Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities, and we've learned a lot from LA and here in San Francisco and Oakland. And one of the big things I've walked away with is government doesn't really know how to buy SaaS. There are some people in purchasing positions that understand conceptually, like, what SaaS is, but when you look at the budget and the way that decisions are made from a purchasing perspective, like, how your product, your SaaS, like, fits into that budget and how they purchase, like, that's sometimes a very square peg in a very round hole. Right? And so there's a lot of work around, like, understanding how a purchase actually happens. And it starts with, like, who's actually making the decision. The other thing is, like, what does it actually look like on your spreadsheet? Like, where does this line item fall in? Like, most governments don't have more money to spend. Right, and that's a good thing for us. That creates a lot of opportunity for us because we can provide these solutions that are more cost effective. But we have to figure out, you have to sit down with your partner and really look at that spreadsheet and say, this is where we can save you money. So I want to just emphasize this idea of same price. So I'll give you an example. Here in San Francisco, we work with 6 city departments. They can't be different prices, right? And so it's really important when you first go in and get that first partner and you say, okay, you know, for us, we actually work for free. That's how we started. But we signed a contract that said we're doing this for free for this amount of time, right? And so slowly over time, we went from free to, you know, where we are, which is a standard price, not just here in San Francisco, but across cities. Why? Because cities are all about comparables. So if the head of planning in Atlanta asks me for a letter from the head of planning here in San Francisco, the next question, a recommendation. The next question is, well, how much did it cost? Did you get your money's worth? So you have to be a little religious in this space that we work in GovTech. You have to be a little religious about your price. And if you are giving someone a discount because they're taking a risk, which is the thing that government hates to do, they hate to take risks for good reason. If you're saying, okay, we're giving you a way to take a risk without the financial cost, there are other costs in there, but without the financial costs, like, you have to you have to make that math transparent.
So we have to wrap up. So would love to hear just kind of 1 minute closing thoughts, anything that came up for you didn't have a chance to share, high impact sales tips for the burgeoning entrepreneurs in the room.
So I will recount our first ever office hours with Paul Graham when we sat down at YC and we were like, okay, hey, Paul, this is what we're doing. We're trying to help build better public transit. He looks at us and he's like, that's not a real company. And we're like, well, we're in YC, so okay. We're in your program. And then he looked at each of us and he said, well, did you guys realize by selling to government, you're starting an enterprise sales company? Like, and he pointed at each one of us and he was like, you're going to become a sales animal. You're going to become a sales animal. You're going to become a sales animal. You're going to become, and we're all just sitting there being like, oh my God, what did we just sign up for? So I would say just, being one of the more external facing founders in our company for the last year and a half, there's just a ton of rejection that you're gonna get, and you're gonna cry a little, and it's gonna be okay because someone out there will want to pay you for what you're building. So that's my closing thought.
That is great advice.
Yeah, make sure you're working with people who you're comfortable crying around. And be there for others when they need to cry too. No, I know it's true. We're all laughing now, but and some days you're going to be laughing and high-fiving and crying in the same day or the same hour, and it's a bit of a roller coaster. I would say that the key is that you don't have to get everything right from the start, whether it's pricing or product or anything else. But the thing you have to be prepared to do is really just be focused on listening to your users and understanding deeply like what their needs are, and that maybe what they're telling you should build isn't actually what you really should build, but understanding, sort of digging deeper and understanding why they have the pain points that they have. And if you're really solving a problem that's painful for someone, then they're going to be willing to pay for it. And so it's just a question of figuring out how to solve that problem, and also with regard to pricing, like what they're anchoring against. Are they anchoring against, just software, or are you saying, hey, what we've actually done is replace a planner or replace a public records officer in your agency? What's the value of that? So, be focused on listening to your users, and also even early on, figuring out how to measure your impact so that you can make that argument.
Raise a lot of money. I'm serious. Like this space, if you really want to get this space, like your first round, like your seed round, it might be a note and you might do $1 million, $1.5 million. But when you actually go into government technology and go out there and try to sell against Microsoft, Oracle, Acela, you have a very tall order. And you're going to have people who are sales animals. And they're going to need like incentives to like actually get out and be super present and really help you grow your company. And it's not cheap.
And on that note, we're going to take. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists?